My son-in-law sent me a text on a Tuesday evening that said, "You're dead weight, old man." Amber agrees. Find somewhere else to live. I read it twice, set my phone face down on my workbench, and smiled. Not because it didn't hurt. It hurt the way a splinter does, small, precise, and impossible to ignore. I smiled because 3 years earlier, I had started preparing for exactly this moment. Before I continue, subscribe to Honest Revenge Stories and drop a comment telling me what time it is, where you're watching from right now. My name is Harold Greer. I'm 64 years old, and I've spent 35 years as a civil engineer in Austin, Texas, building bridges, overpasses, drainage systems, the kind of infrastructure that holds a city together underneath while everyone walks over it without a second thought. I retired at 61 with a full pension, a solid savings portfolio, and a property on Ridgeline Court that I'd owned outright since 2009. 4 bedrooms, a wraparound porch, an attached workshop where I built and restored furniture. I'd lived there alone since my wife passed 6 years ago. After Carol died, the house felt enormous. Too many rooms for one person, too much silence. My daughter was the only family I had left. She'd grown up watching me work in that shop, handing me clamps and sandpaper, asking questions about joinery and wood grain. When she was 12, she helped me build a bookcase that still stands in the living room. Smart girl. Curious, hardworking. She had her mother's eyes and my stubbornness, which I always considered a compliment. Then she married my son-in-law. He came into our lives 4 years ago with a firm handshake, a sales job at a tech company, and the particular confidence of a man who'd never had to work very hard for anything. My daughter brought him to Thanksgiving, and he spent most of the dinner talking about his income potential and asking pointed questions about property values in Austin. I noticed the way he looked at the house, not the way you look at a home, the way you look at an asset. They married a year later. I paid for the wedding, $54,000. I didn't complain. She was my only child, and I had the money. I told myself it was an investment in her happiness. 18 months after the wedding, he lost his job. The tech company restructured, and his entire sales division was eliminated. My daughter called me, and I could hear the stress in her voice, the way it went flat when she was trying not to cry. They were 2 months behind on their apartment rent. Could they stay with me for a little while, just until he found something new? I said yes. Of course I said yes. That was 31 months ago. He found another sales job 8 months after moving in, mid-level, about $68,000 a year. My daughter worked as a dental hygienist, pulling in around 42. Combined, they made more than enough to rent a decent apartment in Austin. But the months kept passing, and they didn't leave. They didn't offer to pay rent. They didn't offer to contribute to utilities. They did, however, redecorate the living room without asking me, replacing furniture I'd built by hand with items they'd ordered online. I found my handmade coffee table in the garage, wrapped in plastic. The disrespect came in the same way water does when it finds a crack slowly, quietly, and then all at once. My son-in-law started referring to the house as our place when he talked to his friends. He rearranged the kitchen because he found my layout inefficient. He had packages delivered daily, boxes piling up in the entryway, never broken down or recycled. He bought a second television for the master bedroom, the room he and my daughter had taken over, and ran the cable in a way that required drilling through a wall I'd finished myself. He didn't ask. I found the hole when I noticed the drywall dust on the hallway floor. My workshop was the last sanctuary. A 12 by 16 space attached to the garage, smelling of sawdust and linseed oil. Walls lined with chisels and planes and spoke shaves I'd collected over 30 years. I was working on a mid-century credenza I'd found at an estate sale, stripping decades of bad paint to find clean walnut underneath. It required patience, long hours of careful work, knowing when to apply pressure and when to let things sit. 6 months ago, I met someone at the community woodworking class I'd started teaching on Saturday mornings at the library makerspace. Her name was Beverly. She was 60, a retired high school principal with strong opinions about dovetail joints and a dry humor that reminded me of my wife in the best possible way. We had coffee after class, then lunch the following week, then dinner. My daughter seemed pleased when I told her. My son-in-law's reaction was harder to read. He went quiet in a way that felt less like acceptance and more like calculation. 2 months into seeing Beverly, I mentioned I'd like to have her over for dinner. Nothing elaborate, just the four of us, getting acquainted. My son-in-law didn't raise his voice. That was never his style. He simply set down his fork, looked across the table with the calm of someone who'd already decided the outcome of a conversation, and said, "I don't think that's a great idea, Harold. We're not really comfortable having strangers in our space." Our space. My daughter looked at her plate. I kept my voice level. "Beverly isn't a stranger. She's important to me. This is my home." "Right. But we live here," he said. "We have a routine. Having someone new in the mix disrupts things." "I brought my wife home after 6 weeks," I said. "You moved into this house after knowing my daughter for 14 months. He smiled the way people do when they've already stopped listening. "That's different." My daughter finally looked up. "Maybe just give it a little more time, Dad. Let us get used to the idea." I left the table, spent the evening in my workshop, running a hand plane across the credenza surface until the grain opened up clean and even. Wood doesn't argue. It just responds to what you give it. That night, at 11:14, my phone lit up on the workbench. A text from my son-in-law. "You're dead weight, old man." Amber agrees. "Find somewhere else to live." I sat on my shop stool for a long time. The credenza gleamed in the work light, all that hidden grain finally exposed. I thought about my daughter at 12 years old, steadying a board while I ran the saw, completely fearless. I thought about the morning I taught her to drive in an empty parking lot, the way she'd laughed when she finally figured out how to ease off the clutch without stalling. I thought about the night her mother died, how she'd sat next to me in the hospital hallway for 4 hours, not saying anything, just present, and how that had been exactly enough. The man who sent that text hadn't made her into something different. He'd just found the door she'd left unlocked. I set my phone down, picked up a piece of 220 grit sandpaper, finished the surface of the credenza with long, slow strokes until it was ready for its first coat of oil. Then I went inside, made myself a cup of coffee, and opened my laptop. I pulled up a folder I'd created 3 years ago, right after the living room furniture incident, labeled simply Documentation. Inside were photographs, receipts, a running log of dates and events, utility bills, property tax statements, the deed to the house, showing my name as sole owner, a scanned copy of the LLC formation documents for Ridgeline Properties LLC, filed in the state of Texas, with myself as the registered agent, a property transfer document, notarized and recorded with Travis County, showing the house at Ridgeline Court as an asset of that LLC. I had moved the house into the LLC 18 months ago, quietly, legally, with the help of a real estate attorney named Diane Whitfield, whom I'd worked with on 2 previous property transactions. I hadn't told anyone. There was no reason to. The house still functioned exactly the same. The only difference was who had rights to it and what those rights meant in a legal context. Diane had explained it to me plainly during our initial consultation. As the sole member of the LLC, I controlled the property completely. Any tenant, regardless of their relationship to me, occupied the space under my explicit permission, which could be withdrawn with proper notice under Texas Property Code, Chapter 91. I'd asked how long the notice period needed to be for someone with no written lease and no payment history. She'd said 30 days, minimum. I typed her an email at 11:58 that night. "Diane, I'm ready to proceed. Can we meet this week?" Her response came at 7 the next morning. "Tomorrow, 2 o'clock. My office." I drove to the meeting without telling anyone where I was going. My son-in-law's car was in the driveway when I left. He was working from home that day, which he did 3 days a week, occupying the dining room table with 2 monitors and noise-canceling headphones, treating the space as his personal office. My daughter had already left for the dental practice. Diane's office was on Congress Avenue, downtown, all glass and polished concrete. She had a directness I appreciated, no small talk, no hesitation, just clear information delivered at a useful pace. "You want to issue a formal vacate notice," she said. "Not as a question. 30 days. Market, rent, or vacate. I want it delivered by a process server, not mailed." She nodded. "Travis County market rate for a 4-bedroom in that area is around $2,800. You comfortable with that number?" $2,800 is fine. I don't expect them to pay it." She understood. "If they don't pay or vacate within 30 days, we file for eviction under the LLC's ownership." Given that there's no lease, no payment history, and they have no claim to the property through any legal instrument, the filing is straightforward. Texas courts move quickly on these. There's a second issue, I said. I slid a folder across the desk. 3 years ago, I co-signed an auto loan for my son-in-law. 62-month term, $36,000. Current remaining balance is approximately $22,000. I want to understand my options for withdrawing from that agreement. Diane reviewed the documents. Texas allows cosigner release petitions, but they require lender approval and typically need the primary borrower to demonstrate 18 months of on-time payments without cosigner assistance. She paused. Did he make those payments on time? Every one. I verified before this meeting. Then he may actually qualify for a release petition, which removes you from liability. She looked up, the irony being that if the release is approved, you're free of the obligation, and the lender will reevaluate his standalone creditworthiness for any future borrowing. And if he needs a new vehicle at some point, he'd qualify based solely on his own credit profile, which, depending on what else happens in the next 60 days, may look significantly different. I signed the initial engagement documents and drove home. My son-in-law was still at the dining room table when I walked through the door. He didn't look up from his monitors. I went to my workshop, put the first coat of oil on the credenza, and watched the walnut grain come alive. The process server arrived at the house 4 days later at 12:30 in the afternoon, while I was having lunch with Beverly at a restaurant near her house. I'd timed it deliberately. I wasn't there when my son-in-law signed for the envelope. I didn't need to be. My phone started ringing at 12:47. My daughter first, then my son-in-law, then my daughter again. I let them go to voicemail and ordered dessert. Beverly raised an eyebrow across the table. They received something, I said. Are you ready for what comes next? I've been ready for 3 years. I finally answered on my son-in-law's 6th call, late that afternoon, when I was back at the house and had settled into my workshop chair. His voice was controlled in the way a person's voice gets when they're furious, but have decided that calm sounds more authoritative. What is this, Harold? What exactly is this document? It's a 30-day notice. You can either begin paying $2,800 a month in rent to Ridgeline Properties, LLC, or you can make arrangements to vacate the property. The choice is yours. You can't do this? We live here? You live here with my permission. That permission is now conditional. This is insane. We're family. Family doesn't text each other to find somewhere else to live. Silence. Then, that was frustration. That wasn't serious. It's documented, and it was serious enough for you to press send. He shifted tactics the way salespeople do, moving from offense to something that sounds like reason. Look, we can work this out. We'll sit down, talk it through. There's no need for lawyers and formal notices. The time for sitting down was 31 months ago, when you moved into my house and decided that contributing nothing while criticizing everything was an acceptable way to live. I kept my voice even. The notice period begins today. Diane Whitfield's contact information is on the document if you have procedural questions. I ended the call. My daughter called 20 minutes later. Her voice had a quality I recognized from her childhood, the sound she made when she was genuinely scared and trying not to show it. Dad, please, can we talk about this in person? Of course. I'm in the workshop. She came out 10 minutes later, still in her work clothes, sitting on the old stool I kept near the door. She looked at the credenza drying on the workbench and didn't say anything for a moment. He didn't mean it, she finally said. The text. He meant it enough to type it and send it. He was frustrated. We both were. You've been pulling away since Beverly, and we didn't handle it well. I set down the cloth I was holding. I want to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. In the past 31 months, have you and your husband paid a single utility bill on this house? She looked at her hands. Have you contributed to property taxes, insurance, maintenance, groceries more than occasionally? Nothing. Have you once, in 31 months, asked how I was doing, not what I could provide, but how I was actually doing? Her eyes went wet. That's not fair. I think it's very fair. I softened my voice, not because I was backing down, but because she was still my daughter, and I could tell the difference between manipulation and genuine pain. I love you. That hasn't changed, and it won't. But love without respect isn't love. It's just tolerance. and I've been tolerating things I should have addressed 2 years ago. She left without resolving anything. I went back to work on the credenza. The next 3 weeks moved the way carefully laid plans do steadily, predictably, with the occasional surprise that turns out to have been inevitable. My son-in-law attempted 4 separate conversations, each with a different approach. Indignation, then negotiation, then guilt, then a kind of wounded dignity that might have worked on someone who hadn't watched him drill through a finished wall without asking. My daughter and I spoke twice more. The second conversation was harder. She told me she felt caught in the middle. I told her gently that I understood, but that being caught in the middle was a position she'd chosen by not speaking up for 3 years, and that the way out of the middle was to make a decision, not to ask me to make it easier for her by backing down. She didn't have a response to that. I submitted the cosigner release petition to the lender during the second week of the notice period. Diane had helped me prepare the paperwork. The lender acknowledged receipt within 48 hours. Per the terms, they would evaluate my son-in-law's standalone application and notify him of the results within 10 business days. If approved, I'd be released from the loan. If denied, the matter would be reviewed further. I was not worried about the outcome. I had done the math. Beverly came over for dinner on a Thursday evening during the 3rd week, her first time at the house. We ate on the back porch with the workshop lights spilling warm through the windows. My son-in-law's car sat in the driveway, but he stayed inside. My daughter appeared briefly to say hello, stiffly, and then went back in. "That was awkward," Beverly said, after a moment. "Progress," I said. She laughed and reached across the table for her wine glass. "You know what I notice about you? You're the least angry person I've ever met who's in the middle of something like this." "I'm not angry." I was, for a while. Then I got organized. Is there a difference? Anger makes you reactive. Being organized makes you effective. I looked out at the yard, the live oak I'd planted 20 years ago now wide enough to shade the whole back half. I spent 35 years building things that had to last. Bridges, drainage systems, foundations. You don't build those by reacting to the moment. You study the load, understand the forces, design accordingly. Then you build precisely. She nodded slowly. And this is the same thing. This is exactly the same thing. The 30-day deadline arrived on a Wednesday. I was at Diane's office when she filed the eviction petition with the Travis County Court. The documentation was comprehensive. Property deed under the LLC, the formal notice and proof of delivery, 31 months of utility records in my name, 0 payment history from the occupants, photographic documentation of various incidents, including the drilled wall and the displaced furniture. The court scheduled a hearing for 3 weeks out. That afternoon, I began quietly moving the items from my workshop into a storage unit I'd rented in Pflugerville. The clocks I'd started collecting antique clocks the year before. Something Beverly had introduced me to the tools, the lumber stock I'd been seasoning, the finished credenza, which I'd decided to keep for my next home. Each piece I loaded into my truck felt lighter than the thing itself. I was removing weight I hadn't realized I'd been carrying. My son-in-law watched from the garage doorway for a few minutes without speaking. Then he said, "Where are you going with all that?" "Somewhere it's appreciated." "You're serious about this?" "I've been serious for 3 years. You're only noticing now." He stepped forward. His expression had changed. The controlled salesman calm was gone, replaced by something rawer. "I have a loan review letter from the bank. They're saying my application for the cosigner release was denied because my debt-to-income ratio doesn't qualify without your backing. They're opening a full account review. I had expected this. The timeline on the paperwork had been intentional. That's between you and the lender. Harold," his voice dropped, "if they call that loan, we can't cover it. Then you should have built better credit before making life difficult for the person co-signing it." He stood there. For the first time in 3 years, he didn't have a next move prepared. "What do you want from us? Tell me what you want." I closed the tailgate on my truck. I wanted basic respect. For 31 months, I wanted to feel like a person in my own home rather than a problem to be managed. I wanted my daughter to have married someone who understood that generosity isn't the same as obligation. I turned and looked at him. "You had 31 months to figure that out. You spent them redecorating my living room and texting me to find somewhere else to live." I got in my truck and drove to Beverly's house. where I'd been staying for the past week. The court date came on a clear October morning. I arrived with Diane 20 minutes early. My son-in-law and daughter were already in the hallway when we got there, sitting with a legal aid attorney who looked exhausted before the day had started. My daughter met my eyes briefly. I nodded. She looked away. The judge was a compact man in his late 50s named Rutherford, with reading glasses on a chain and the expression of someone who'd seen every variation of this situation enough times to stop finding it interesting. He reviewed Diane's submissions for several minutes before he said anything. LLC ownership of the property. Clean documentation. No lease agreement. No payment history. He looked over his glasses at my son-in-law's attorney. What's the defense? The legal aid attorney argued hardship and family obligation. She argued that my sudden reversal was retaliatory, connected to a new romantic relationship, and that evicting the occupants without cause was cruel given the length of their residency. She did a reasonable job with the material she had. Then Diane stood up. Your Honor, the opposing counsel's characterization of this as without cause overlooks the fact that cause is not legally required when there is no lease, no payment, and proper notice has been given. The 30-day notice was delivered in full compliance with Texas Property Code 91.001. The LLC owner is entitled to possession of his own property. She paused. Additionally, if counsel wishes to discuss the length of residency as establishing some form of claim, I'd invite her to address why 31 months of free housing, conservatively worth $86,000 in market rent, does not instead establish a debt owed to the property owner. Judge Rutherford took off his glasses. Is there any written instrument lease, family agreement, anything in writing that establishes these occupants' right to remain in the property? The legal aid attorney conferred with my son-in-law for a moment. No, Your Honor. Any evidence of payment of rent, utilities, or expenses? No, Your Honor. The judge put his glasses back on. Then there's nothing to adjudicate. The LLC owner followed proper procedure. Possession of the property is granted. Occupants have 21 days to vacate. My daughter made a sound that wasn't quite a word. My son-in-law stared at the surface of the defendant's table. Their attorney gathered her papers with the efficient composure of someone moving on to the next case. In the hallway afterward, my daughter caught up with me before I reached the exit. She looked like she hadn't slept. Dad, can we please just talk? Yes. Call me this week. We'll have lunch. I held her gaze. Not with him, just you and me. She nodded, slowly. I walked out into the October sunshine with Diane. The live oaks along the street were turning. That particular gold that Texas manages for about 3 weeks in fall before the leaves drop all at once. Beautiful and brief. What's next? Diane asked. I list the property. Already have a buyer-interested couple I met through Beverly. They've been looking in that neighborhood for 2 years. And your son-in-law's loan situation? That's his situation. I've done everything I'm legally required to do. She shook my hand. You were remarkably calm through all of this. I had 3 years to get there. The bank's full account review concluded the following week. Without my income as co-signer backing, my son-in-law's standalone debt-to-income ratio failed the lender's threshold. They issued a notice requiring either a qualified replacement co-signer or full repayment of the remaining balance within 30 days. He had no replacement co-signer. He did not have $22,000. The vehicle was repossessed on a Friday afternoon from the driveway of the rental house they'd moved into a 2-bedroom apartment in Pflugerville, the only thing they could secure on short notice. I didn't learn the details from them. I learned them from my daughter at lunch, over tacos, on a Tuesday. She was different without him sitting next to her. More like herself. More like the girl who'd handed me sandpaper in the workshop and asked questions about wood grain. He's angry, she said. That's understandable. He thinks you planned all of this from the beginning. I planned for the possibility. He made it a certainty. She was quiet for a moment, rolling her straw wrapper into a small coil. Mom used to say you were the most patient person she'd ever met. That you never rushed anything, but you also never let anything slide forever. She was right. I let things slide that I shouldn't have. She looked up. I knew he sent that text. I didn't tell him not to. I didn't tell you he'd sent it to apologize. I just hoped it would go away. I know. Are you angry at me? I thought about it honestly. I was. I'm not anymore. You made choices out of conflict avoidance, not malice. That's fixable, if you want to fix it. She reached across the table and put her hand over mine for a moment. It was a small gesture. It meant more than 31 months of the alternative. The house sold in 3 weeks. The buyers were a couple in their mid-30s, a nurse and a school teacher, who'd saved for 7 years to buy in that neighborhood. They walked through the house with the reverence people reserve for things they've worked hard for. The nurse paused in the doorway of the workshop space. Could we keep this as a workshop? That's exactly what it should be. We closed on a November afternoon. I walked through the empty house one final time before signing. The living room looked wrong without the furniture that had been replaced, but the handmade bookcase was still there. I'd told the buyers about it, and they'd wanted to keep it, something I'd built by hand, staying in the house. That felt right. I netted $340,000 after the remaining mortgage and closing costs. Added to my pension, my rental portfolio, and my retirement accounts, it was enough to build whatever came next. Beverly had found a property in Dripping Springs, 30 minutes west of Austin, on 2 acres with a converted barn that had 1,800 square feet of open floor space. Workshop potential, she'd said, with the particular smile she used when she was certain about something. We put in an offer the day after closing. My son-in-law called once, about a month later. I answered because I'd decided I would answer, once, and say what needed to be said. "You destroyed us," he said. His voice had the flat quality of someone who'd been saying the same sentence to himself for weeks and had stopped believing it fully. "No," I said. "You built something unstable and called it solid. When it fell, you looked for someone to blame. You're her father. You were supposed to help us. I helped you for 31 months. What you're describing isn't help. It's subsidy without limit, extended in exchange for contempt." I sat down on the porch of Beverly's house, watching a hawk circle over the pasture across the road. "I have one question for you, and I'd like an honest answer." Silence. If our positions had been reversed, if I had lived in your house for 2.5 years, contributed nothing, treated you like an inconvenience, and then sent you a text telling you to find somewhere else to live, what would you have done? A long pause. "That's different." "It isn't. That's exactly my point. I watched the hawk drop below the tree line. I hope you figure out what you want your life to look like. I genuinely do. But that's work you have to do yourself." I hung up and sat for a while in the quiet. He didn't call again. My daughter and I had lunch every other Tuesday. We didn't talk about him much. We talked about her work, about a continuing education course she was considering, about a road trip she was thinking of taking. We talked about her mother, which we hadn't done in years, stories we both remembered differently, laughing at the gaps. She came out to Dripping Springs in December and helped Beverly and me hang shelves in the workshop barn. She held the level while I drove the anchors, exactly the way she had at 12 years old. "You built another bookcase," she said, looking at the stack of white oak drying on the rack along the east wall. "2, actually. Beverly claimed one already." She ran her hand along the grain. "Teach me how you do the joinery? Come out Saturday. I'll show you." She came out Saturday, and the Saturday after that, I think about what I was doing the night I read that text in the workshop. The work light on, the credenza surface open and clean after all that stripping. There's a particular moment in furniture restoration when the piece finally shows you what it's been all along underneath the bad paint, the neglect, the accumulated damage of being used carelessly. You don't create that quality. It was always there. You just have to be willing to do the patient work of removing what's covering it. That's the thing about choosing yourself. It doesn't feel like revenge, even when other people call it that. It feels like restoration, like stripping back the layers until you find what was always there, underneath everything your own worth, intact and waiting. The clocks Beverly and I had started collecting were arranged along the workshop wall now, 10 of them in various states of completion, ticking in that overlapping rhythm that sounds like chaos until you listen long enough to hear the pattern. Each one had been broken when I found it. Each one ran now. Some things can be fixed, if you're willing to take them apart carefully and put them back together right. Some things have to be let go so that something better can have room. I'd finally learned to tell the difference. If this story meant something to you, hit like, subscribe to Honest Revenge Stories, and tell me in the comments, was I right to wait 3 years? Or should I have acted sooner? I'd genuinely like to know what you think.